some empires were not conquered. They were handed away in an afternoon of trust. A king walks into a plaza with no weapons. A tight formation of ships scatters in the middle of the night. A general watches his own reserve turn and ride away mid-battle. One mistake here took less time than a meal to finish an empire. Hannibal's wasted victory. In August 216 BC, Hannibal Barca leads a Carthaginian army against Rome near the village of Cannae in southern Italy. His double envelopment traps and destroys a Roman army before nightfall, among the worst defeats in Roman history. Hannibal has just broken the largest army Rome can field, but everything changed when the Carthaginian Senate, swayed by his political rival Hanno the Great, refused to send the siege equipment and fresh troops he needed to march on Rome itself. According to the Roman historian Livy, Hannibal's own cavalry commander told him he knew how to win a battle, but not how to use the victory. Rome rebuilt. Hannibal spent the next 14 years fighting in Italy without ever taking the city, until Carthage recalled him home to face a new Roman general, Scipio Africanus. At Zama in 202 BC, Scipio's army broke Hannibal's forces for good, and Carthage surrendered its empire. Military schools still use the word Cannae as shorthand for a battle of total annihilation, a name that outlived the empire that lost it and the one that won it. No one can say what would have happened if Hannibal had turned north instead of waiting for permission he never got. The night Valens couldn't wait. You are on the plains outside Adrianople, in what is now Edirne, Turkey, on a hot morning in August, 378 AD. Roman scouts report a Gothic camp nearby, smaller than it actually is. 2 years earlier, Rome had let a wave of Gothic refugees cross the Danube for safety, then let corrupt local officials starve and cheat them until they revolted. Emperor Valens now faces that same Gothic army, and reinforcements from his co-emperor Gratian are only days away. But Valens couldn't wait. Unwilling to share the credit for a victory he expected, he attacked immediately. Before the Gothic cavalry, absent at the start of the battle, returned and encircled the Roman line. Valens died on the field. His body never recovered. The Gothic tribes that broke Rome's army that day never fully left the empire again. Some historians still teach Adrianople as the first crack in a wall that finally came down in the west a century later. Roman writers at the time counted the dead at up to 2/3 of the empire's entire eastern field army, the worst single-day loss Rome had suffered in 700 years. A reserve that rode away. How do you lose an empire's frontier in one afternoon without losing the battle first? In 1071, Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes marches deep into Byzantine Armenia to meet the forces of the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan near Manzikert, in eastern Turkey today. Romanos has the larger army and a real chance to push the Seljuks back for good. Then his own reserve commander, Andronikos Doukas, a rival from a competing noble family, pulled his troops back in the middle of the fighting instead of reinforcing the emperor's line. The Byzantine formation broke apart, and Romanos himself was captured, the first Byzantine emperor taken prisoner on a battlefield. Alp Arslan released him under a peace treaty within days, but by the time Romanos made it back home, his rivals had already stripped him of power. The civil war that followed let Turkic tribes settle across Anatolia, land the empire never fully recovered. To this day, historians still argue over whether Andronikos Doukas withdrew out of cowardice, confusion, or a deliberate plan to see the emperor lose. Spears against muskets. By the late 1500s, the Songhai Empire controls one of the richest trade networks in West Africa, built on Saharan gold and salt, and its army still fights largely with spears, bows, and cavalry, the same weapons that had won its wars for a century. Across the desert, Morocco's ruler, Ahmad al-Mansur, has spent years training a smaller force armed with muskets and cannon, weapons Songhai's generals have mostly dismissed as unsuited to the terrain. At Tondibi, in 1591, Askia Ishaq II sent an army of roughly 40,000 men, most without firearms, to meet around 4,000 Moroccan soldiers under the commander, Judar Pasha. Gunpowder broke the Songhai line within hours, and the empire's capital fell soon after. Songhai never reunited as a single state again. splitting into smaller kingdoms that Morocco could not fully control either. Historians of the region still mark Tondibi as the day gunpowder, not numbers, decided who ruled West Africa. No one can say what would have happened if Songhai's generals had adopted firearms even a decade earlier, before Judar Pasha's army ever crossed the Sahara. A king walks into a trap. You are standing in the town square of Cajamarca, in the Peruvian highlands, on a November afternoon in 1532. The Inca Emperor Atahualpa arrives with a retinue of several thousand men, most unarmed, carried on a litter, and dressed for a ceremonial meeting, not a battle. Waiting inside the buildings around the square are fewer than 200 Spanish soldiers under Francisco Pizarro. Atahualpa has just won a civil war against his own brother, and commands an empire stretching thousands of miles down the Andes, and he has been warned that the strangers might be dangerous. But everything changed when he walked into the square anyway, confident that his own army, camped nearby, made him untouchable. Pizarro's men opened fire and charged, and within a few hours they had killed thousands of Atahualpa's escort and captured the emperor himself, without losing a single Spaniard in the fighting. Atahualpa offered a ransom room filled with gold and silver to buy his freedom. The Spanish took the gold and executed him anyway, in July of the following year. Historians still call Cajamarca one of the fastest collapses of a major empire on record. Thousands of armed escorts defeated in a single afternoon by fewer than 200 men, without losing one of their own. The fleet, the wind, erased. By the 1270s, Kublai Khan commands the largest empire the world has ever seen, stretching from Korea to Eastern Europe, and he has already conquered Song China's northern territories using overwhelming naval and land forces. Japan is among the last nearby powers still outside his control, and Kublai builds enormous invasion fleets meant to end that. He launched both invasions, in 1274 and again in 1281, during typhoon season along Japan's western coast. The first fleet withdrew after storm damage and stiff samurai resistance near Hakata Bay. Kublai returned 7 years later with an even larger force, reportedly thousands of ships and well over 100,000 men, only for another massive typhoon to destroy much of the fleet before it could land its full army. Japanese chroniclers named the storms kamikaze, divine wind, a word later borrowed by World War II pilots who hoped for the same kind of miracle against a very different navy, and the phrase is still used in English 700 years after the empire that inspired it disappeared. No one can say what would have happened to Japan, or to the rest of Kublai's ambitions in the Pacific, if those two storms had simply arrived a week later. Moctezuma's costly welcome. In November 1519, the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II welcomes Hernán Cortés and a few hundred Spanish soldiers into Tenochtitlan, the capital of an empire of millions built on a lake in the Valley of Mexico. Moctezuma could have ordered the causeways connecting the city to the mainland cut, trapping the small Spanish force inside a city surrounded by water and a much larger Aztec force. But Moctezuma chose diplomacy instead, housing Cortés's men inside the palace and treating them as honored visitors for months, while Spanish soldiers quietly studied the city's defenses. Cortés eventually took Moctezuma hostage inside his own capital, ruling the city through him for months until the citizens turned against their own emperor entirely. During the chaos of what the Spanish later called the Night of Sorrows, Moctezuma died attempting to calm his own people from a palace balcony. Spanish accounts claim Aztec stones killed him. Aztec accounts claim Spanish blades did. To this day, no source has settled which side actually struck the blow that ended his life, or the empire he had ruled. The Armada that beat itself. How does a fleet of more than 120 ships lose to a smaller one without losing most of its ships in battle? In 1588, King Philip II of Spain sends that fleet toward England, meant to carry an invasion army across the English Channel and end Queen Elizabeth's rule. English ships damaged the Armada in running fights through the Channel, but it is still largely intact when it anchors off Calais. Then English fireships sent the Spanish fleet into panic during the night, and the tight defensive crescent that had protected it for weeks scattered apart. Scattered and unable to link up with the invasion army waiting in the Netherlands, the Armada's commander chose to sail home around the north of Scotland and Ireland instead of back through the channel. Autumn storms wrecked dozens of ships along that coastline, and thousands of sailors drowned or died on foreign shores. By the time the survivors reached Spain, fewer than half of the ships that had sailed for England remained, and Spain never fielded a fleet that large again. Darius flees first. You are on the plain of Gaugamela, near modern Mosul, in Iraq, in October 331 BC. Darius III has leveled the ground himself to give his scythed chariots room to charge, and his Persian army vastly outnumbers the Macedonians facing him under Alexander the Great, the same Alexander whose old tutor Aristotle is still assigned in classrooms today. For most of the morning, the battle holds close, with Persian cavalry pressing hard on both Macedonian flanks. But everything changed when Alexander drove his companion cavalry straight at a gap near the Persian center, close enough to threaten Darius's own position on the field. Darius turned his chariot and fled before his line had actually broken, and the retreat of their own king spread panic through the rest of the Persian army faster than any Macedonian sword could. What had been a real fight became a rout within minutes. Alexander took the heart of the Persian Empire within 2 years of that single retreat, and Darius was killed not by Alexander, but by his own general Bessus, fleeing east. No one has ever fully explained why a commander with the advantage in numbers, position, and ground he chose himself decided to run before his line collapsed.